Back in the days when I was predominantly a database administrator, etc., etc. However, now my bio is more like this. So obviously for the benefit of those I've yet to meet, my name's Kevin Chant. I'm a data engineering manager living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a large international company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, if you kept up with that, you're in a good place for this session. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95. That's as much I say about that. Over that time, I've had experience in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and health insurance industries. I've gained a fair few certifications along the way. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, and I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP for Microsoft Fabric technology area. Now you can find me online a few different places, as you can see on the screen here. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky as at Kev Chant. My LinkedIn's got a nice user-friendly URL. I have my own blog where I blog a lot about data platform and developer technologies, quite often the two together. More recently, I've done quite a few posts relating to Microsoft Fabric. In addition to that, I have my own GitHub site, which contains templates that you can download and use to perform CI/CD for various applications and services, such as SQL Server, analysis services, and more recently, Microsoft Fabric data warehouses. Anyway, now it's time for us to go back in time and have a look and see how to use Power View with SQL Server 2014 and SharePoint 2013. So just to make sure everybody's right, this session will be focusing on working with Power View reports in SharePoint 2013 on site. You can work with Power View in some versions of Excel as well. So you can go in and create Power Pivot tables, and then on top of those, work with Power View reports. However, we will be focusing in this session on how to get it all running on SharePoint for various reasons, which you'll see in the session. And I'll be showing how you can use data sources to links to SQL 2014 analysis services sources on Windows Server 2012 R2. And just to give you a bit of a taster of what's to come in this session, here is some Power View items that are available within a SharePoint site running on my machine. So I'm using Internet Explorer to show you this. So what is Power View? So Power View is a data virtualization tool developed by Microsoft as part of their BI suite. So as you may have noticed, over time, they've been building more and more BI services and applications. And it allows staff at various levels within the business to visualize data that's stored. Because as some of you are probably aware, historically, there's been a dedicated team to create all of the data and the reports for business users, basically people in various different departments in the business. And now there's a way to allow users to do their own report authoring, either like I mentioned just now in Excel spreadsheets or through SharePoint and creating SQL Server analysis services databases in a simple format. And like I mentioned, you can create these reports in Excel or in SharePoint. And we're focusing on the SharePoint aspect in this session. So some benefits of using Power View in SharePoint, like I mentioned just now, it allows report authoring directly within a web browser. So there's no need to have anything installed locally apart from obviously the web browser itself. It's self-service, as I kind of hinted earlier as well. It removes the need for people within the business to have a dependency on a centralized team to be able to create and deliver the reports for them. And it allows the business users to actually present the data how they see fit, because as some of you are aware, multiple people can have different ways to present the same data. And it allows you to hide the complexity of the source data from end users as well, because you can, for example, use a semantic model to have user-friendly field names. Some additional benefits includes the fact that data collaboration is made easier. So basically, when you're working with Power View and SharePoint, you have the luxury of either creating a brand new Power View item from scratch, or actually working on a report that's already been created within Purview and it's running on SharePoint. And it allows a central point of administration as well, because all of the Purview report, Purview, I should say, not Purview, slip of the tongue, that technology doesn't exist yet in 2014. So when you're working with Power View, all of the reports can be centrally stored within one SharePoint site. And that SharePoint site can be customized as well. So you can introduce your company's branding onto the SharePoint site if you want to. As I mentioned in the additional link here. Another advantage, if you are working with Power View reports on the SharePoint site, is that you can actually display thumbnail images as well in what's known as the Power Pivot Gallery. And I will show this later in the session. So some uses for these reports include empowering users to visualize the data, as I mentioned earlier, in SQL Server analysis services, creating key performance indicators for the business. So you can dynamically in these Purview reports highlight key performance indicators where required. You can look to utilize hierarchies created in analysis services as well to create drill-through reports. So I have one example, as you can see on the slide there. There are lots of other examples as well, and I will, time permitting, show you some as well in this session. You can also use it to create report templates. As I mentioned just now, other users in the business could actually create the reports beforehand for people to use. You can export the reports into PowerPoint slides as well. And this is quite interesting because you can export these Power View reports either statically, so it shows a set moment in time how the report looks. However, it can also be interactive as well. And I will show you an example of this shortly. I do have a screenshot of one particular interactive report, which appears not to be available fully at this moment in time due to a particular issue with the maps in the back end of Bing. But the idea is when you're working with this in SharePoint, you can actually click on the different colors to get all the information effectively, or to do advanced filtering as well. Like I said, I will do a demo shortly as well to give you a better idea. Now, I want to go through the installation requirements to set up Power View in SharePoint, because there are a few different applications and services involved. So it can take a while, and you'll probably want to introduce a level of automation to do this. So first of all, you need to have SharePoint 2010 or 2013 Enterprise Edition installed on a server that's within an Active Directory domain on premises. You also need a SQL Server database engine installed, ideally accompanied by one or more analysis services instances to get the maximum benefits. either the Enterprise or the Business Intelligence editions for 2012 or 2014. So for working with tabular BI semantic models, and I'll talk a bit more about these shortly since they are the newer version, you require SQL Server 2012 or above. For multi-dimensional databases, you need to have SSAS, SQL Server Analysis Services, Servers Pack 1 with cumulative update 4 installed or above. Some additional requirements include SQL Server Power Pivots for SharePoint installed, and that's available through the SQL Server 2012 or 2014 setup. Reporting services for SharePoint as well, and the reporting services add-in for SharePoint products. Now, it's worth noting here that the last two options can be selected when you're going through the SQL Server setup, as you can see on the screen here. Now, before we go any further with the slides, I'm going to go straight in and show how I've got this particular demo set up for all of you today, because it is running on a single server. So one thing to note as well, it's actually running, and I will zoom it here, it's actually running on a SQL Server on a Hyper-V machine that I'm using locally. When you're doing this within the workplace, you would clearly have it if you're going to run it on a single machine in a multiple environment, but I'll talk more about the number of machines shortly. So here is my virtual machine. Now, if I go to WinFor here, you'll see I'm running Windows Server 2012 R2. We go through the services here. You will see, and I will use CMET for this, so you don't need to squint your eyes here, folks. I have got multiple SQL Server instances installed, including a SQL Server database engine, also got a tabular SQL Server Analysis Services instance installed, as well as a multi-dimensional SQL Server Analysis instance installed, and a Power Pivot instance installed. And these are all here, as you can see, running locally on my machine. Now, some of you may have noticed something a bit interesting about the version numbers, and that is because if I go to the properties here, I'm actually running, will it show me on this? Nope. I will type the full text. So I'm actually running SQL Server 2014 CTP on this machine. Obviously, now we're at the beginning of 2014, so only the CTP version of the SQL Server 2014 is available at this moment in time. So all of these instances with the databases, etc., are all 2014. And if I zoom in, you can see some of the databases that were installed during the SharePoint installation. So a key point to remember here, ideally install the SQL database engine before you install SharePoint so you can specify the databases it uses. Talking of SharePoint, and you may have seen earlier that I've actually in SharePoint admin got SharePoint installed, and this is the SharePoint administration. I click on the service applications. As you can see here, I have got the Power Pivot service already up and running configured. And in addition to that, the Excel application as well up and running, and SSRS, which allows me to start working with that SharePoint site that you saw earlier. And let me zoom in here. As you can see, all I had to do was create a site collection to start creating my new site collection. Now, behind the scenes, because if I go to management service application, as you can see for my site, I have got the web application here, and I can click to manage it here. The backend for this particular site is actually running in IIS, so Internet Information Service. So As you can see, I've got the website and everything configured here for use with SharePoint. So I have to go through the installation of all of that. Ideally, you should automate this by doing PowerShell if you are looking to do this setup yourself. So we have all of the SQL services installed. We have SharePoint as well to be able to run it as well. I must admit, because this is demos for single use, as you may have noticed towards the bottom of the screen, I have installed a couple of additional applications as well. In the real world, you'd actually install these on a separate client, but for the benefit of today's session and this particular demo, I have put on there installed Visual Studio and a couple of the Microsoft Office applications. Now, whilst we're talking about SQL Server, I will quickly show you, for example, how the databases look behind the scenes for both the multi-dimensional database, which is what most people have worked with for the longest period of time since they've been available in analysis services for some time. I also have some databases for the tabular instance as well, as you can see here. So one's based on EssentialWorks and other offerings. Now, to create these particular ones in the tabular model, there's a few different ways you can do this. You can restore from a backup, or you can build one up yourself in Visual Studio. So for example, here, I will use Summit to navigate around some of these elements so you don't need to squint. This is a tabular model based on EssentialWorks. As you can see, I've got lots of these populated with data as well. You can navigate through all the individual tables at the bottom. On the right-hand side, and just to highlight this, when you do go to create a tabular model, which is fairly new in 2014, you create they are created as part of what's known as a bin file, which you can rename. In this particular example, it's not being renamed yet, but I could just right-click and rename this bin file if I want to. Now, working in this tabular model means that I can do various things, working with what's known as DAX expressions, etc. If you've been working with Excel already, you're probably well aware of what DAX is. I'll give you a few examples if I can flip through here now. Let me see if I can find some for you. So in this particular internet sales table, and I will actually make this a bit more readable for you all if I can stretch it out. So towards the bottom, in the grid at the bottom, I can specify aggregation measures, and I can look at the formulas towards the top. So here, as you can see, is a bit of an example of using a bit of DAX to specify a value. Also got other examples elsewhere as well. And there's a lot of other things you can do when you're creating these tabular models. And I will talk about these a bit more shortly, but I thought I'd quickly show them here in Visual Studio since they're part of this setup. So I will carry on a bit more depth about these tabular models shortly, just showing you how you can create them. So that was the setup on my single server. So if you're going to do a similar thing, my recommendations are to install the SQL SharePoint 2013 prerequisites first. You get a link to select these during the installation anyway. However, there are workarounds to install these as well. And you must use these workarounds anyway if you're going to install a version of SharePoint on Windows Server 2012 prior to Service Pack 1. When you're going to actually, after doing the prerequisites, when you're going to deploy SharePoint, I strongly suggest not to do the standalone installation. In fact, you won't be able to use this properly. And preferably as well, don't select to run the SharePoint products configuration wizard at the end of the installation, just so that you can do all of your additional configurations smoothly to get PowerView running after the fact. So note as well that SharePoint installation 2013 installations, which are not Service Pack 1 or above, are not supported on Windows Server 2012 R2. Now, as I mentioned earlier, ideally you should install your database engine before you look to install SharePoint. In addition to that, you should look to install at least one analysis services instance, either tabular or multi-dimensional. SQL Server 2014 supports running Power View reports on both, so you have the luxury of being able to choose there. Multi-dimensional models, in other words, building those cubes, have been around for quite some time now, since the days, if I remember correctly, SQL Server 7. Whereas tabular models is something fairly new that's been introduced in SQL that you can work with in SQL Server 2012, but they're very powerful. So they are worth looking at. And I suspect in the future, they're already popular now, and I suspect in the future they will become more and more popular for multiple reasons. Anyway, should also look to install SQL Server Power Pivot for the SharePoint role, as I showed you in the screenshot earlier. So doing this after the installation allows you more flexibility in your configuration. And you can actually look to do this either with the SQL Server 2014 Installation Center or with PowerShell. Now, you may notice during installation, if you are doing it with SQL Server 2014 CTP version, you may get an error like the one that's on the screen saying that access is denied. A quick resolution for this is to actually just find that file, deselect it from being read-only, and then carry on with your installation. It is that simple to resolve it. So, bit of advice, if you do intend to deploy Power View across the SharePoint farm, like I mentioned earlier, do strongly suggest you look to use PowerShell. And of course, install, as I mentioned earlier, the SharePoint and the reporting services add-in for SharePoint features onto your initial SQL Server instance after you've done your SharePoint installation. Doing this will ensure that everything will work smoothly, because as you can see, there are a few different setup configurations you must do. Once you've done that, you can then fine-tune using the central administration tool, like I showed you just now, or again with PowerShell. And then once you've done all that, and as I showed you earlier, you can create a new SQL Server Reporting Services application in SharePoint so that it can be used for Power View. And again, as I mentioned earlier, strongly suggest using PowerShell. Now, to run Power View and to start working with reports, I should say, with Power View, you actually need the Silverlight add-in installed for that specific browser. And be aware that the Silverlight add-in only works for certain browsers, by the way. However, interesting note, 2014, HTML5 is currently being piloted for viewing these reports, which potentially means that the Silverlight dependency will cease. So you won't have to install the Silverlight add-in anymore, because obviously that is a critical thing. You cannot work with Power View running in SharePoint within a browser without this add-in. So hopefully this will mean in the future, if this does happen, that would be more flexible browser support. Unless, of course, that the testing is actually going to be intended for something new. So maybe potentially in the future, you'll see some other service where you can work with these reports, which isn't Power View and doesn't have that Silverlight dependency. Now, this is the list of supported browsers at this moment in time. And this is taken from SQL Server 2014 Books Online. So as you can see here, the newer version of Internet Explorer you have, the better chance there is of it being supported. And I will zoom in a bit here so you can see up for yourselves. In addition to that as well, the latest version of Apple Safari actually supports it. So if somebody is working on a Mac and they've got Apple Safari installed, they can potentially look to use it as well. Now, there are some potential workarounds if you're not using a supported browser. You can use a remote desktop connection, so you can connect that to a server that has a supported browser installed instead. Alternatively, you can publish the browser as make it a published app for web access on a platform like Citrix, for example. So you can just go off to a site and then select the publish application to open the browser up there. On a related note, there is a Microsoft Remote Desktop app available now for iPads. So obviously I came up with these workarounds mostly for people that are working with other devices like Apple's, etc. Now, there is one other workaround you can look to try as well. If you're using a mobile device off-site, you can reverse proxy back to a server that has the supported browser installed. However, this particular solution is quite complex and can potentially introduce some security issues. Anyway, enough about setting the groundwork for actually deploying SharePoint and everything else to make sure you can start working with the reports. Now let's focus on the actual reports themselves. So once your SharePoint site is up and running, you can create links to work with Power View reports using either report data sources or BI semantic model connections. So BI semantic model connections is a newer method. I will talk a bit more about that in a minute. So reports are data sources are a more generalized way to create data sources for your Power View reports. They can be used to create sources for either tabular or multi-dimensional analysis services databases. The reality is they can work with other sources as well, but if you're looking to work with Power View reports and work with analysis services, it supports creating sources to both. So one proviso for this working with multi-dimensional analysis services databases is that the compatibility level must be correct. So it has to be a certain version. So ideally, I think it's 2014 or above. And these data sources can be shared by other applications as well, including SQL Server reporting services, because it is essentially the same idea. Now, bit of advice here, if you are going to work with report data sources within your SharePoint site to work with Power View, if you move it elsewhere, then you will probably need to re-enter any stored credentials that you've entered. In addition to that, you may need to reselect enable this source at the bottom of the screen. And I will show you that in an example shortly. So when you're configuring a SSAS data source, report data source, I should say, you can actually specify the prospective name as well. So what you actually do is when you're working on a connection string, you put in the name of the perspective where you would traditionally enter the name of the cube. And I will show you an example of this shortly. So now let's talk about BI semantic model connections, which are used to connect to tabular sources. Now, these sources can be either our pivot table you've created in an Excel workbook, or a tabular instance of SQL Server analysis services. Like I said, there are various reasons why the tabular instances are becoming more and more popular. So as you can see on the screen, the connections can also be a source for other applications that can utilize BI semantic models as well. Anyway, Now it's time to do a few demos on the different sources to semantic model connect, including report data sources and BI semantic model connections and Excel sources as well. So let's go back over to our demo environment. So as I did mention to you all earlier, when you're working, for example, here, and I will zoom it so you can zoom around, when you're creating a database for a tabular instance like this particular one, you can create it in Visual Studio. There's quite a few different advantages to working and creating a tabular database or cube essentially in Visual Studio, because you can do lots of more advanced things on here. You can work with perspectives, you can work to create rows. If I go over to the tables, you can see I can work with relationships. One other interesting thing, if you are looking to create these in Visual Studio, you can also look at the model of your data as well. Now this one is quite involved, as you can see. I do have another example though, courtesy of an example that was made available for another offering. So as you can see here, I can look directly at the data model that I'm working on for that particular database when I'm working within Visual Studio and creating this database for the tabular model or tabular database. I can also manipulate a lot of things here. I can add the hierarchies. I can manage the relationships here. So if I click on any of these relationships, for example, I can see the properties on the right-hand side up here. So as you can see, there is a lot you can do when working with these databases in a tabular instance of SQL Server analysis services. And like I said, I think these are going to become very popular in the future, or even more popular. Anyway, let's go back over to the demo for working on these connections. So here, as you can see, I've got some report services, and I zoom in here in place. MD stands for multi-dimensional, so I do have some multi-dimensional reports created here, well, report data sources. Now, to create a data source, before I even show these, you go to Files. I can select New Document, and that will allow me, as you can see, to create either a BI semantic model connection or a report data source. And then once I've created them, I can, for example, look at the data source definition if I want to. Now, bear in mind, this is running Internet Explorer on my local machine and is connecting up to my virtual machine, so at times there will be a delay. So as you can see here, the connection string is not very complicated to connect up to the multi-dimensional instance running locally. Here is where I mentioned earlier, where you may need to reselect enable the source. The more interesting of this is connecting to the actual perspective. So I'm just going to jump straight to this one. And as I mentioned earlier, and I did promise I would show this, when you're connecting to a specific perspective, you do need to put in the name of the perspective when you're stating the cube. So you, instead of specifying the cube name, you actually enter the perspective name. Now I've got connection to a tabular model here. So I've got one here connected to good old Adventure Works. So as you can see, when I look at the data source definition for this one, it's very similar as how you specify connecting up to a multi-dimensional database. Now for BI semantic models, it can be interesting as well. So I've got one here based on the tabular model. So if we look at this particular one, this time around, as you can see, I'm literally just connecting directly up to the database, and that is it. Now, so that's the database I've pre-created on a tabular instance of SSAS. In addition to that, what I can do is actually upload a Excel spreadsheet which contains Power Pivot table, which is connected to a tabular instance like I've got here. So I will zoom in here. So I've got the Excel spreadsheet here. That's already got a predefined tabular model in there. And then what I've done, you look in this particular BI semantic model connection, instead of specifying the name for my tabular instance of analysis services, I've actually specified the name of the Excel spreadsheet, which I uploaded to SharePoint. So that's highlighting the many different ways I can create sources within this particular SharePoint site to use with Power View. Now, before I even go any further and show you Power View running, just some considerations here. If you're using multi-dimensional cubes, then you need to make and you're using it from previous edition, you'll need to upgrade the compatibility level. So bear that in mind. Anyway, this finish with going through how to actually work with a Power View report. So there's two ways to create a Power View report. Either I can click directly on one of those sources I showed you earlier, or I can click on the ellipsis and then click on the ellipsis again and click on Create Power View Report. So with that in mind, let's actually go and look at a Power View reports now. And I can actually show you a few different things what's there. So as I mentioned, very quick, easy way to start working with a Power View report is go to one of these sources, actually click on it, and that will load up the canvas for me to work with Power View. And as I mentioned earlier, this is going from my local machine to the virtual machine. Sometimes there is a delay. So let's have a look on this and have a better look. So this is known as the canvas, this blank area here. On the right hand side, as you can see, I have all the different fields that are available in my tabular database, and I can click on any of these and start bringing data directly into the canvas, as long as there's actually data there, as you can see. And I can build this out over time, and I will show you some pre-cooked examples to save a bit of time in this session. So this is the field list here. Once I start populating, so I just click on the field list here. Let's see if I can find one that's actually got some more information in there. But I will go straight to a pre-populated report shortly, so I can show you some more of this. So this is the canvas, this is the field list. I can actually do filters here, as you can see. At the top, I have multiple options. And when I'm working in certain areas, I get some more options as well. And what I'm actually going to do is open up a pre-populated report to show you some more of these options a bit better. So what I'm actually going to show you now, so that obviously clicking on any of their sources will open up a report. I also have a Power Pivot. You can also, when you go to save the reports, save them in various places, either on the site or into this Power Pivot gallery. So like I said, you can either save them here in the main shared documents location, where I've got various items already that you can have a look at. Or I can go to the Power Pivot gallery to start looking as well. So I'm just going to open up, for the benefit of time for this session, we have 6 minutes left. So let's have a quick look at some of the reports here to give you a better idea of what we can do. So I'm just going to go into this particular report, and this will allow me to show you some other functionality as well. So I'm just going to edit this report that I pre-created. As you can see here, I've got certain fields available. I can switch between which ones are active in all of them. So if I scroll up here, for example, See all the different ones here. When I actually click within the design that I'm working on at the time, it will show me all the active ones as well. As you can see, I can dynamically change the types of charts or graphs that I'm working with. So I've got multiple options here. If I want to, I can change this to a table, to a matrix, to a card layout, etc. I can look to use maps as well. As I mentioned, there is an issue with the Beam backend at the moment. I have various styles I can work with as well. But the one thing I want to highlight at this moment in time, if we go back, leave this page, is that there's a vast amount of things that you can do. So excuse me, I was just looking very quickly for the one that I actually have preset to work with for the stuff. So bear with me a moment. What I can actually do instead, I will work that quickly. So I want to give a very quick example before we finish this particular session. So as you can already see from there are a lot of things I can do already. Depending on the type of charts I'm working on, I get two tabs. So I get the design tab here, as I showed earlier, where I can do a lot of things. In addition to that, I also get layouts on here where I can define things like chart titles, how the legends are going to be viewed, working with data labels, etc. So a lot of this, you can see I can do filtering, but I can also do filter in the entire report by clicking on certain objects to make it interactive. I can work with different views as well to introduce different levels of interactiveness between the views, working either with the same data or different. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can export these to PowerPoint as well. So if we go back to my virtual machine, for example, so here I've got PowerPoint. At the moment, there's nothing I can do with it. This is all static as one image. However, if I click on from the current slide, you'll notice I have an interact button appear. If I click on that, what happens is all of a sudden I'm live interacting with the actual data behind the scenes. So if I go to export the report from PowerView to PowerView to PowerPoint, I can be interactive with the reports in there as well. So because I can do all of those rich things with the tabular model, I can work with hierarchies, etc., KPIs. As you can see here, I can work with KPIs and actually work to do drill down as well because I've got the hierarchy set up. So I can drill further depth, as you can see here, drill up and down in the report. And the reality is there's a whole host of other things I can work with, the data manipulations that have been done in tabular models, etc., directly in my browser here to work with the PowerView reports. So as I showed you just now for populating the report, I can drag onto the canvas. There's various examples in the Power Pivot gallery that allow you to have the thumbnail images, etc. Now, I do have some links to share with you all relating to this as well. So I will put those into the chat now for you all. In addition to these links you see on the screen, if you do want to know more about working with PowerView, I do have a book recommendation as well. And this is a really good book to get you started working with the concepts of PowerView with some good examples. However, now we must go forwards back to 2014. So obviously in 2015, Power BI was introduced. which had introduced a more amount of offerings to the community and let you install everything onto the client. And then eventually we had Microsoft Fabric installed as well. Hello, Felix. I can see you on the big cam, by the way. So, like I said, Microsoft Fabric was introduced in 2023 during Microsoft Build. And Power BI was introduced in 2015. So Power BI, as you can see, now you get this nice desktop with a lot of the similar capabilities that you had with Power View in the past, as well as obviously a lot more advanced features which have been introduced over the years, plus external tools because it's been built up by the community. And then we had Microsoft Fabric introduced in 2023, initially during Microsoft Build. And you can work with various compute offerings there. Anyway, that's it for now because this is a 45-minute session. Are there any questions from anybody?